Welcome to Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
It's episode 40. Let's get into it.
This week is about the routes we stopped checking because they worked yesterday. The shipping lane that is still open on a map but suddenly costs more courage, insurance, and military coordination to cross. The water treaty that still has a name even after the cooperation underneath it has gone quiet. The road out of town that can be an escape, an opportunity, or both. None of these systems announces the moment it becomes fragile. Most of the time, the first warning is that something ordinary starts taking longer, costing more, or producing two different answers, depending on where you look.
So the road can be open and still not be usable.
Exactly. We have 10 stories in what you didn't see in the news, a week-ahead calendar built around inflation, the Fed, bank earnings, and one enormous semiconductor listing. A knowledge bomb on whether Washington can help bring back the starter home, and a humor me about what Jack Kerouac's road trip actually cost. Then the greater debate asks whether opportunity is something you leave home to find or something you stay and build. And we close with Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who solved a problem by hiding the structure inside the machine. Let's go.
Each week we explore ideas that help you pause, reflect, and think more deeply about the opportunities all around you.
It's the perfect mix. A little information, a few stats, some real-world insights, and just enough deep talk to make you feel smarter before your second cup of coffee. A quick thank you to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai, chronicling the absurd, the ambitious, and the algorithmically challenged corners of the AI agent economy. Start with the Strait of Hormuz, where the most important word this week is not closed. It is impaired. Commercial traffic through the strait slowed to unusually low levels after renewed fighting between the United States and Iran and attacks on vessels using the route. Some LNG tankers and Qatar-linked ships still made the crossing. Other vessels reportedly switched off their tracking signals or waited for coordinated passage closer to Oman. So this is not a clean blockade. It is something harder for markets to model, a shipping lane that remains physically passable but has become dangerous, expensive, opaque, and politically conditional. Brent crude finished the week near $76 a barrel, up meaningfully for the week, but nowhere near the kind of panic price you might expect if traders believed 1/5 of the world's oil supply was about to disappear for months.
Which means the market is not saying nothing happened. It is saying this probably does not last.
Right? And that is still a bet. The more immediate pressure may show up in shipping insurance, delivery schedules, tanker availability, and refined products before it appears as a spectacular crude oil spike. A barrel can have a quoted price while the cost and risk of moving it change underneath. That is the hidden story. The route does not need to be legally closed to stop behaving like a normal route. Now move northeast from the Persian Gulf to the rivers that cross India and Pakistan. India reiterated this month that the Indus Waters Treaty will remain in abeyance until Pakistan, in India's words, credibly ends its support for cross-border terrorism. The treaty has survived wars and repeated crises since 1960, but India suspended participation after the 2025 attack in Kashmir and stopped the normal exchange of some hydrological information. Pakistan depends on the Indus system for the great majority of its irrigated agriculture. India cannot simply turn the river off like a faucet, but data, dam operations, project approvals, and timing all matter when farmers are planning around water that crosses a contested border.
This is one of those disputes where the absence of cooperation is the event.
Exactly. There may be no single dramatic morning when a water crisis begins. It can arrive as worse forecasting, tighter planting decisions, lower reservoir confidence, and eventually higher food prices. That is why this belongs in an economics show. Resource conflict usually enters the public conversation late, after it has changed crop output, trade flows, insurance, migration, or political stability. Next, a story that should be much louder than it is. The Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo has now passed 1,800 confirmed cases and is approaching 650 deaths. Africa CDC has described it as the continent's fastest-growing Ebola outbreak. Suspected cases have appeared outside the original areas, and a United States humanitarian worker has now tested positive. The strain is Bundibugyo virus, for which there is no approved vaccine or standard treatment. Containment is being complicated by conflict, attacks on health facilities, limited funding, and the basic difficulty of tracing people across unstable regions.
And because the outbreak does not currently feel close to most American listeners, It gets treated as if it is small.
That is the uncomfortable part. The lesson from outbreak response is not that every infection becomes a global pandemic. It is that undercovered emergencies often become harder and more expensive because resources arrive after the disease has built its own infrastructure. Attention is not a cure, but the absence of attention can become part of the transmission system. Now, a very different kind of contagion, retail traders remembering that short squeezes still work. Wendy's shares surged in late June after traders on Reddit and other social platforms gathered around a beaten down, heavily shorted stock with a famous consumer brand. The move was fast, meme-like, and largely detached from any overnight transformation in the number of hamburgers being sold. The important number was not the daily sales count, it was the amount of stock already sold short. Once a crowded bearish position met a sudden wave of buyers, some short sellers had to buy shares to close their positions, adding fuel to the rally.
So Wendy's did not become a better restaurant in 24 hours.
Not 26% better, no. The reason to keep watching the episode is not because Wendy's is the next GameStop. It is because the market mechanism remains available. A familiar brand, a depressed price, heavy short interest, a small enough float, and an online crowd can still create a temporary market where the position matters more than the company. Retail speculation did not disappear. It went dormant and waited for a recognizable mascot. From a stock market hiding pressure to a labor market doing the same. China is projected to have roughly 320 million people in flexible employment this year, about 44% of its workforce. That category includes delivery drivers, ride-hailing workers, freelancers, platform workers, and people moving between jobs without a conventional full-time contract. Gig work is acting as a shock absorber. It gives laid-off workers and graduates somewhere to earn. It also keeps people from appearing as fully unemployed. But a shock absorber is not the same thing as an engine. Many flexible workers earn less than they expected, compete in oversupplied markets, and remain outside the social insurance system. China can report that people are working while still facing a deeper problem about job quality, income security, pensions, and consumer confidence.
Employment answers, did you work? It does not always answer, did the work build a life?
And that distinction is coming to more countries than China. The more work migrates into flexible arrangements, the more governments will need to decide whether benefits belong to the job, the platform, or the person. Otherwise, the labor market can look resilient, while the welfare system quietly loses contributors. Back in Washington, a housing bill just became law in one of the least ceremonial ways possible. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act took effect after the president allowed the constitutional 10-day period to expire without signing or vetoing it. The legislation combines dozens of provisions aimed at making housing easier to build and finance. Environmental review changes, manufactured and modular housing reforms, small-dollar mortgage pilots, pre-approved building designs, appraisal and financing updates, and restrictions on certain large institutional investors buying additional single-family homes. This does not lower mortgage rates on Monday morning. It does not force a town to approve duplexes. And several pilot programs will still require rulemaking, appropriations, or local action before buyers see anything.
So this is not a house. It is a new set of tools left at the job site.
That is the right way to think about it. The opportunity is in watching who picks them up. Which lenders start making small mortgages? Which communities create pattern books and faster permitting? Which states make modular and manufactured homes easier to finance? Which builders can produce entry-level inventory at a cost the conventional system stopped supporting? The law matters. Implementation will decide whether it becomes housing policy or housing paperwork. Now to the World Cup, where the matches are producing crowds, but not always the travel boom host cities were promised. Ticket prices became so high that some international fans appear to have stayed home. European flight bookings into most United States host cities were running below the prior year, and bookings into New York were especially weak, even though the region hosts the final. Hotel expectations in several markets were revised downward. At the same time, local fan festivals have drawn enormous crowds, including hundreds of thousands in Atlanta. That tells us the demand for the event is real. The demand for the most expensive version of the event is less certain.
People want the party. They just may not want the flight, the hotel, the resale ticket, and the $12 bottle of water.
Exactly. Mega events are usually sold as citywide economic accelerators, but the revenue and the cost do not land in the same places. FIFA controls the central commercial machine. Cities pay for security, transportation, public space, staffing, and cleanup. Hotels and restaurants benefit only if visitors actually arrive and stay. The economic question is not whether the World Cup is popular. It is whether popularity converts into local spending after the price of participating becomes a barrier. Now for the summer trend that sounds like it was invented by a committee of nutritionists and day traders: fiber maxing. Google says searches for dietary fiber reached an all-time high this year, while searches for fiber maxing rose 115% in 90 days. At the same time, searches for making a Hugo Spritz at home jumped 2,200%. Those two trends do not share a nutritional philosophy. They share a cultural one. People are treating summer as something to optimize, improve the gut, perfect the drink, track the sleep, engineer the vacation, take an ordinary behavior and add a suffix that makes it sound like a competitive strategy.
We used to eat vegetables and have a cocktail. Now both require a protocol.
That is the consumer signal. Search trends often reveal demand before a brand has found the packaging language for it. So the likely result is not just more fiber. It is fiber repositioned as performance, convenience, satiety, longevity, and personal control, followed presumably by a canned spritz to help everyone relax after working so hard on digestion. Two science stories to close. Researchers working with the Super-C Consortium used machine learning-guided screening and quantum calculations to help identify two new superconducting compounds. The important achievement is not that either material works at room temperature. They become superconducting below 1 Kelvin, which is extremely cold. The breakthrough is the search process. The universe of possible material combinations is too large to synthesize and test one by one. Machine learning can help eliminate unlikely candidates and direct expensive laboratory work toward the smaller set that physics says is worth making.
So the computer did not discover the magic material. It helped scientists stop wasting time on the wrong shelves.
Precisely. That method could matter far beyond superconductors. Materials science is full of enormous search spaces: batteries, catalysts, magnets, semiconductors, alloys. A better search method does not guarantee a revolutionary result, but it increases the number of intelligent experiments science can afford to run. And finally, the frog. A study published in 2025 resurfaced this week after researchers reported that a bacterium isolated from the intestines of Japanese tree frogs eliminated colorectal tumors in a mouse model after a single intravenous dose. The bacterium, Euangella americana, appeared to accumulate in tumors, attack cancer cells, and activate an immune response. In that specific experiment, the treated mice achieved complete responses. Now, the large warning label: mice are not people. A living bacterium placed into the bloodstream raises safety, dosing, manufacturing, and immune response questions that stand between an animal result and any human therapy.
So this is not frog bacteria cures cancer.
Correct. It is a strange biological result is interesting enough to keep testing. And that is still a remarkable story. Nature has spent millions of years conducting experiments in competition, defense, symbiosis, and survival. Drug discovery increasingly means learning how to search that library without pretending the first promising page is the finished book. That is the list. Now let's wake up ready. This is your macro weather report for the week of July 13th through the 18th. The busiest morning is Tuesday. At 8:30 Eastern, the Bureau of Labor Statistics releases the June Consumer Price Index and the Real Earnings Report. The first thing to remember is that this is June data. It will not capture the current week's disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. That matters because people will be tempted to read Tuesday's number as a verdict on a story that happened after the measurement period ended. The useful questions are simpler. Is shelter inflation continuing to cool? Are core services still sticky? Did goods prices reaccelerate? And after adjusting for inflation, did wages give households any additional purchasing power?
So if oil moves on Monday and CPI lands on Tuesday, those are two different clocks.
Exactly. One is a live market, the other is a photograph of last month. The next major event begins a few hours later. Federal Reserve Chair Kevin Warsh appears before the House Financial Services Committee Tuesday, then the Senate Banking Committee Wednesday. This is his first semi-annual monetary policy testimony as chair, and lawmakers will be testing more than his rate outlook. Listen for how he describes inflation, how much forward guidance he is willing to offer, and how he responds to questions about central bank independence. The market already understands that inflation remains above target. What it does not know is how Warsh wants to communicate uncertainty. Does he present the Fed as waiting for more evidence? Does he emphasize the risk of acting too late? Does he separate a temporary energy shock from a broader inflation process?
And if he refuses to give a clean answer?
That may be the clean answer. Warsh has signaled less enthusiasm for telling markets exactly what the Fed plans months in advance. Tuesday is also the biggest bank earnings day of the summer. JP Morgan, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, and Goldman Sachs are all expected to report, with more banks following later in the week. Forget the ritual of asking whether earnings beat by 3 cents. Watch the underlying businesses. Are deposit costs still rising? Is loan growth improving? Are credit card delinquencies and charge-offs stable? Did trading and investment banking revenue benefit from active markets? What do executives say about the consumer, commercial real estate, and the possibility of higher policy rates?
The press release tells you what happened. The conference call tells you what management is afraid might happen.
That is usually where the useful information lives. Wednesday brings the Producer Price Index, another inflation reading that can show pressure earlier in the supply chain. It also brings the second day of Warsh testimony and earnings from major financial and technology names. Across the week, semiconductor investors will be listening to ASML and Taiwan Semiconductor for evidence that the extraordinary spending cycle around advanced chips is still converting into orders, margins, and production capacity. Netflix adds a consumer and advertising signal later in the week. Then there is SK Hynix. The South Korean memory chip company completed a record-setting United States share sale and began trading on NASDAQ Friday under a temporary ticker. The shares opened well above the offer price and are scheduled to settle into the SKHY ticker Monday. The important question is not whether the first-day pop survives hour by hour. It is whether the enormous demand for the offering becomes durable ownership or merely a spectacular opening trade.
A record listing can prove there is appetite. It cannot prove the appetite has a stop button.
Exactly. SK Hynix sits at the center of high-bandwidth memory demand, which makes it a company story and a referendum on how much capital markets still want to pay for the AI infrastructure cycle. Now connect all of this to rates. The 10-year Treasury yield ended Friday around 4.5%, close to its highest level in roughly 2 months. A hotter CPI report, hawkish testimony, or stronger than expected growth commentary from the banks could push yields higher. Softer inflation or evidence of consumer strain could pull them back. But the part of the curve to watch most closely after the testimony may be the front end, because 2-year yields respond more directly to changing expectations for Federal Reserve policy. And finally, keep watching the Strait of Hormuz. Not simply the Brent quote. Watch whether normal vessel traffic returns, whether more ships travel without public tracking, whether insurers keep raising premiums, and whether coordinated passages become routine or exceptional. My personal watch for this week is the gap between the commodity market and the shipping market. If crude prices behave as though the disruption is temporary, while insurers and ship operators behave as though the risk is becoming structural, one of those markets will eventually have to revise its story.
And that is how you wake up ready. Here is today's knowledge bomb. Washington may be trying to bring the starter home back from the dead. That does not mean Congress lowered mortgage rates. It does not mean the house you bookmarked on Zillow will return to its 2019 price. And it definitely does not mean a federal agency is about to place a charming 2-bedroom bungalow on your front lawn. What changed is less dramatic but potentially more useful. The 21st Century Road to Housing Act tries to repair some of the machinery that made inexpensive homes unusually difficult to build, finance, and buy. Start with a small mortgage. An $80,000 home sounds easier to finance than an $800,000 home. But the lender still has to process an application, verify the borrower, order an appraisal, meet disclosure requirements, close the loan, and service it afterward. Many of those costs do not shrink in proportion to the mortgage. That means a borrower can find a house they can afford and still struggle to find a lender interested in making the loan. The new law authorizes a HUD pilot for mortgages with original principal balances of $100,000 or less. It also directs regulators to examine points, fees, and compensation rules that may discourage lenders from originating small loans. The pilot is not operating nationwide tomorrow. Rules have to be written, lenders have to participate, and authorized programs may still need funding. But the direction matters. The federal government is finally acknowledging that the cheapest homes can be the hardest ones to finance. Knowledge bomb number 2. The next starter home may not look like the starter home in your head. For decades, the default picture was a detached house on a private lot with a driveway, a yard, and a garage containing sporting equipment nobody remembers buying. That format has become expensive. Land, labor, materials, utilities, and permitting all cost more. In many places, zoning also makes smaller or denser housing difficult to build. The law supports reforms involving manufactured housing, modular construction, accessory dwelling units, pre-approved designs, and more efficient financing. For a first-time buyer, the opportunity may be one side of a duplex, a townhouse, a modular home on a smaller lot, a house with an accessory apartment, a property near transit where the household can avoid the cost of a second car. Affordability does not always mean finding a better loan for the same house. Sometimes it means allowing a different house to exist. Knowledge bomb number 3. Local government is now the signal. Washington can create frameworks and incentives. It cannot pour a foundation in your county. The communities that matter will be the ones that shorten permit times, approve more types of housing, adopt pre-approved building plans, coordinate utilities and transportation, and make it possible for builders to produce homes at entry-level prices. A reform passed this year does not become a finished house next Thursday. A builder still needs land, financing, crews, infrastructure, and buyers. So do not treat the law as an immediate nationwide price cut. Treat it as a map. Which cities are actually approving duplexes and townhouses? Which counties are making modular development easier? Which lenders begin offering small-dollar mortgages? Which builders can repeat a pre-approved design without restarting the process every time? Those places may produce tomorrow's affordable inventory before national statistics notice. Knowledge bomb number 4. The individual buyer may get a clearer lane in some transactions. The law restricts certain large institutional investors from buying additional single-family homes while preserving exceptions for parts of the rental and new construction markets. It is not a complete removal of Wall Street from housing. Please return the parade permit. But housing transactions are often decided at the margin. One fewer cash-heavy institutional bidder can matter when several families are competing for the same house. The law will not make every home affordable. It will not eliminate down payment problems. It will not repair years of underbuilding in one season. What it may do is reopen pieces of the market that gradually stop functioning. Small mortgages, smaller homes, factory-built construction, denser neighborhoods, and local development systems designed to approve something other than a large detached house. Most buyers are trained to watch one number, the mortgage rate. Now they should watch the structure around it. Watch the lenders. Watch the zoning meetings. Watch the modular builders. Watch the communities that measure homes completed rather than plans announced. The first-time buyer opportunity is not one giant federal giveaway. It is the possible return of an entire category of housing America became very good at discussing and surprisingly bad at producing. And when a market begins changing slowly, the advantage usually belongs to the people who notice before the change becomes obvious. And that's the knowledge bomb.
Humor me. In On the Road, Sal Paradise begins his trip west in 1947 with about $50. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $750 today. Which sounds romantic until you try checking into a hotel with $750 and tell the front desk, "Do not worry, I will be gone by October." The trip is remembered as a triumph of freedom, spontaneity, and American possibility. Economically, it was also an advanced seminar in not paying retail. Sal hitchhikes. He sleeps on floors, he stays with friends, he takes temporary work, he borrows money, he occasionally treats hunger as a scheduling conflict. In other words, the road trip was financed through a complicated portfolio of cash, favors, hospitality, charm, discomfort, and other people's gasoline. We usually think of barter as two farmers beside a fence negotiating 3 chickens for a wheelbarrow. Modern barter is more subtle. Your friend helps you move. You buy pizza. Your neighbor watches your dog. You spend 6 months pretending not to notice that his hedge is now partly on your property. A startup offers employees equity instead of salary. That is barter, except one side is trading labor for a colorful presentation about the future. When prices rise, economists measure what happens to money. People respond by changing the transaction. You stop buying lunch and start attending meetings where lunch is provided. You stop paying for professional advice and ask a friend. Purely hypothetically, what would happen if someone had not filed taxes since 2022? You stop booking hotels and begin reconnecting with relatives in strategically located cities. Inflation does not simply increase prices, it improves our memory of everyone we have ever met. The official calculation says $50 became roughly $750. But that assumes the traveler is buying approximately the same basket of goods. Sal Paradise was not buying the basket. He was borrowing the basket, sleeping beside it, and asking whether the basket knew anyone headed toward Denver. A modern recreation of that trip would cost far more if every ride, meal, and room entered a cash register. The original budget worked because many parts of the journey never did. The real travel account included trust, family support, temporary labor, social risk, personal discomfort, and the willingness to become somebody else's unusual afternoon. So yes, $50 in 1947 is about $750 now. But $50, 3 couches, 9 strangers, 1 seasonal job, 2 borrowed meals, and a complete absence of concern for personal boundaries? That is apparently worth a literary career. Inflation tells us what money has lost. The road reminds us how much of life was never purchased in the first place.
There are debates that stop your scroll, and there are debates that clear the dinner table. It's time for the greater debate. When opportunity feels scarce, should you move toward it or stay where you are and build? It sounds like a private decision, the kind made after graduation over cake and nervous advice from relatives. But underneath it sits nearly every argument Americans have about ambition, loyalty, family, work, and whether a hometown is a foundation or a ceiling. Americans move less often than they did a generation ago. The annual rate has fallen from around 1 in 5 people during parts of the 1960s to fewer than 1 in 10 today. We have better luggage and fewer departures. At the left lectern stands Jack Kerouac, patron saint of the road. At the right stands Cormac McCarthy, who looks less like he came to debate than to determine whether the building is structurally sound. They are not quoting books tonight. They are carrying the worlds they wrote. No slides, no moderator interruptions, just 2 visions of America arguing over what distance is 4. Kerouac begins gently. Moving, he says, is not abandonment. It is information. A young person born in a town with 1 large employer, 1 social hierarchy, and 1 approved version of success does not yet know whether they have failed. They may simply be standing in a market that has no price for what they can do. A new city can reveal that the awkward kid was merely misplaced, the underpaid worker merely unseen, the family disappointment unusually employable somewhere else. A murmur travels through the room. Everyone knows someone whose life changed because a bus ticket, an enlistment, a college acceptance, or a damaged car placed them beyond the reach of people who had already decided who they were. Kerouac presses. Labor markets are maps of mismatched demand. If your town has no work for nurses, coders, welders, artists, machinists, or teachers, remaining there does not make you loyal. It may simply make your talent cheap. Movement carries skill from where it is abundant to where it is scarce. The country grows because people can leave yesterday's economy and enter tomorrow's. McCarthy asks what is being counted. A higher salary? An apartment in a city where rent absorbs the increase? A better title, purchased with distance from aging parents, old friends, free child care, and the neighbor who owns every tool you will ever need? Economists measure wages more easily than belonging, he says, and then act surprised when their measurements recommend loneliness. The room tightens. McCarthy's first case for staying is compounding. Remain in a place long enough, and people learn your name, then your character, then what they can trust you with. Reputation becomes credit before a bank ever sees it. Relationships reduce the cost of finding work, raising children, starting a business, surviving illness, and hearing about an opportunity before it becomes a public listing. The person who stays may be accumulating an asset that cannot be packed because it exists between people. Kerouac answers without contempt. Community is real, but so is captivity wearing community's coat. A town can know your name and refuse to revise its opinion. Family can support you or draft you into a role you never chose. The kid who made one mistake at 17 may still be paying interest at 30. Sometimes anonymity is not loneliness. Sometimes it is mercy. That lands. Kerouac's second argument is that movement is practice in becoming. Leaving forces a person to discover which parts of identity are portable. You learn to approach strangers, solve problems without inherited instructions, recognize opportunity before it feels safe, and survive the embarrassment of being new. The road does not guarantee wisdom. It removes the illusion that the life you inherited is the only one available. McCarthy leans toward the lectern. Movement can become a system for avoiding evidence. New job, new town, new relationship, new explanation. The traveler calls it reinvention. Everyone left behind calls it a pattern. A person may cross a continent without moving 1 inch away from the habit that ruined the last place. The audience goes silent. Kerouac is visibly struck, and for a moment the romance drains from the road. He concedes it. Motion can be escape disguised as courage. If every difficulty becomes a departure signal, no craft deepens. No friendship survives inconvenience, and no community receives enough of you to return anything meaningful. You can spend a life collecting beginnings and call the absence of endings freedom. Moving should open a life, not become a substitute for one. McCarthy does not celebrate. He builds his second case. Places survive because some people stay. Schools, clinics, shops, farms, family businesses, volunteer departments, churches, parks, and local newspapers do not run on personal optimization. They run on continuity. Every glamorous city attracting ambitious newcomers is supported by people who maintain pipes, teach children, care for grandparents, remember floodlines, and know which promises were made before the new people arrived. The road itself is a product of rooted labor. Then comes McCarthy's knockout. If every talented young person is taught that ambition means departure, struggling places are not merely abandoned, they are blamed for being abandoned. Their doctors leave, their entrepreneurs leave, their tax base thins, their schools lose families, and then those who departed point back and say, see, nothing happens there. Mobility can rescue individuals while deepening the conditions that made rescue necessary. Kerouac responds quietly. No person is public infrastructure. A 24-year-old does not owe a town the sacrifice of their one life because policymakers, employers, and property owners failed to create a future there. Staying to build is noble only when staying is a choice. Otherwise, birthplace becomes assignment. His knockout arrives without volume. Rootedness is praised most enthusiastically by people whose wealth gives them the option to leave. They recommend loyalty to those who cannot afford the deposit in the city where the jobs are. That rattles the room. McCarthy acknowledges his weakness. Staying can become fear with a heritage plaque attached to it. Places can demand loyalty while offering no reciprocity. They can preserve buildings and destroy possibility, protect property values and exclude newcomers, romanticize family while trapping the person who provides unpaid care. There are towns a person should leave and histories they should refuse to inherit. Sometimes the brave act is to go. The two men now stand less like opponents than witnesses called by different sides of the same case. Kerouac admits that a life without roots can become weightless. McCarthy admits roots can become restraints. Kerouac says a society needs open roads. McCarthy says it also needs places worth returning to. The real divide is no longer between movers and stayers. It is between those who choose and those who are trapped. Maybe prosperity is having enough mobility to leave without requiring departure as the price of dignity. Maybe belonging is having enough rootedness to stay without surrendering possibility. The road matters because it offers an exit. Home matters because an exit is not the same thing as a destination. A healthy country should let young people test the horizon without making them refugees from opportunity. It should also let them remain near the people they love without charging an ambition tax. The audience does not get a winner. It gets a harder question to carry home. Are you staying because you're building or because you're afraid? Are you moving because you are growing or because you have learned to flee before anything can ask something of you? The road can save you. the place can save you. Either can become the story you tell to avoid the other. And that is the greater debate.
Let's invent again. Here's a problem that only looks obvious after somebody solves it. For much of the 19th century, a balloon was essentially a large gas envelope, with people and equipment hanging underneath. It could rise, but it was difficult to steer, difficult to scale, and largely dependent on the wind. Make the envelope much longer, and it wanted to bend, deform, and lose the shape required for controlled flight. Ferdinand von Zeppelin had seen military observation balloons during the American Civil War and spent decades thinking about a more dependable aircraft. He was a retired German army officer, not the obvious founder of a new transportation industry, and he did not fly his first machine until he was in his 60s. His insight was structural. Do not ask the gas bag to hold the entire craft together. Build a light, rigid frame, place multiple gas cells inside it, cover the frame with an outer skin, attach engines and controls, and let the skeleton carry the shape. Zeppelin's first airship, the LZ-1, flew in 1900. It was about 420 feet long and held hydrogen in 17 separate gas cells. The rigid By 1910, Zeppelin airships were carrying paying passengers through DLAG, often described as the world's first commercial airline. The internal frame changed the question from can a balloon drift to can an aircraft this large become a system? That scale created new uses: passenger travel, reconnaissance, long-distance flight, and military operations. It also magnified every unresolved risk. A larger craft carried more lifting gas. It required more complex ground handling. It encountered weather as an enormous surface. It depended on engines, crews, navigation, infrastructure, and public confidence working together. The Hindenburg disaster in 1937 is often simplified into one sentence: hydrogen caught fire, and the airship era ended. The real ending was more structural. Hydrogen was hazardous. The exact ignition sequence remains debated. Fixed-wing aircraft were becoming faster and more practical. Airships were expensive to operate and vulnerable to weather. And once the world watched the Hindenburg burn, public confidence disappeared faster than the engineering could be defended. The rigid frame was not the cause of the disaster. It was the innovation that made enormous airships possible, and enormous scale made the consequences of every remaining weakness impossible to hide. That is the invention worth carrying forward. A hidden structure determines what a system can become. And when a system scales, the structure does not merely scale its strengths. It scales the consequences of whatever the designer left unresolved. That's it for another episode of Wealth and Means, advice dressed up like hard work.
We hope you enjoyed the arc, from superconductors to inflation, and from road trips to starter homes. The pattern was simple, that leaving means growth or staying means loyalty. Sometimes those assumptions are true. The useful habit is checking.
Subscribe, rate, and share this episode. It helps more than you think.
We do this for you, to help you have a better week, a sharper mind, and maybe even a longer attention span.
And a special thanks to our sponsor, agentweekly.ai.
Till next time, stay curious.
Stay kind.
And keep compounding.